The question hit Jennifer Walsh like the back of her husband's hand across her face. Standing at the Family Feud podium in her carefully chosen long-sleeved blouse, the one that covered the finger-shaped bruises on her arms, she felt the familiar surge of panic that came whenever attention was focused on her. The studio lights felt too bright, too exposing for a woman who had spent 10 years learning to make herself invisible. "What are you afraid of?" Steve Harvey had asked. And those 4 simple words unlocked a vault of terror that Jennifer carried with her every moment of every day. Her eyes moved instinctively toward the audience, where her husband Mark sat in the 3rd row, watching her with the same cold stare that usually preceded violence. The silence stretched as Jennifer tried to find an answer that wouldn't get her killed when they got home. It was Thursday afternoon at the Family Feud studios in Atlanta. The Walsh family had driven down from Nashville, Tennessee, though Jennifer had begged Mark not to come. She'd hoped this might be her one day of freedom, her chance to smile and laugh without calculating the consequences. But Mark never let her go anywhere alone. The game had started with Jennifer's heart already racing. The Walsh family was competing against the Martinez family from Arizona, and Steve was working his usual magic with the crowd. But Jennifer couldn't focus on the game because she could feel Mark's eyes boring into her, monitoring every word, every gesture, every breath. For 10 years, Jennifer had lived in a prison disguised as a marriage. It had started small, Mark telling her what to wear, who she could talk to, how she should behave. Then came the pushing, the slapping, the punches that he was always careful to land where they wouldn't show. Now at 34, Jennifer was an expert at concealing evidence. The makeup covering the bruise on her left cheekbone was perfectly applied. The long sleeves hid the fingerprints on her arms from when Mark had grabbed her too hard yesterday. The smile she wore was practiced, perfected through years of pretending everything was fine when people asked. "Going home tonight?" Jennifer whispered into the microphone. The words came out barely audible, but they carried the weight of a woman facing her own execution. Steve's expression immediately changed, as he processed not just what she'd said, but how she'd said it. The cameras captured the fear in Jennifer's eyes as she glanced nervously toward the audience. This wasn't normal game show anxiety, this was primal terror. Steve's years of experience told him something was seriously wrong. "Going home tonight?" Steve repeated gently, stepping closer to Jennifer. "Sweetheart, what's wrong with going home?" His voice was soft, non-threatening, but his instincts were screaming that this woman was in danger. Jennifer's hands started shaking as she realized what she'd revealed. Mark would be furious that she'd said anything, furious that she'd drawn attention to their private business. She could already picture his face, feel his rage building like a storm she couldn't escape. I shouldn't have said that," Jennifer stammered, glancing again at Mark. Even from the stage, she could see his jaw tightening, his hands clenching, the warning signs she'd learned to read like a survival manual. "It's nothing, I'm just tired." But Steve Harvey had been watching people for 40 years, and he knew the difference between tired and terrified. He followed Jennifer's gaze to the audience and spotted a man in the 3rd row whose expression was cold, angry, predatory. The pieces began to fall into place. "Jennifer," Steve said, his voice taking on a protective tone that surprised even him. "Look at me, not at the audience. Just look at me." He positioned himself between Jennifer and Mark's line of sight, creating a barrier that was both physical and psychological. "Are you safe at home?" Steve asked directly. The question hung in the air like a lifeline for a drowning woman. Jennifer's eyes filled with tears as she realized someone had finally asked the question she'd been desperate to answer for years. "No," Jennifer whispered, so quietly that the microphones barely picked it up. "No, I'm not safe." The admission felt like jumping off a cliff, terrifying and liberating at the same time. The studio fell completely silent. Even the crew members stopped what they were doing as they realized they were witnessing something unprecedented. This wasn't entertainment anymore, this was a woman asking for help on national television. Steve's face hardened as he understood the full scope of what was happening. He'd heard about domestic violence, supported charities that fought it, but he'd never had a victim reach out to him directly during a live taping. His next decision would either save a life or potentially endanger it further. "Security," Steve called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone taking control of a dangerous situation. "I need security at the third row." The camera operators, confused but responsive, followed his gaze to Mark, who was now standing up with an expression of barely controlled rage. Mark started moving toward the stage, but security personnel were already intercepting him. "That's my wife," he shouted, loud enough for the entire studio to hear. "She doesn't know what she's saying. She has mental problems." The classic abuser's deflection, claiming the victim was crazy, was on full display for everyone to see. Jennifer flinched at his voice, instinctively stepping backward even though she was safely on stage. Steve moved closer to her, creating a protective presence. "Jennifer," Steve said firmly, "you don't have to go anywhere with him. You don't have to go home tonight. You don't have to go home ever again if you don't want to." His words were a revelation to a woman who had forgotten she had choices. Behind the scenes, producers were frantically calling domestic violence hotlines and local law enforcement. This had gone far beyond television into real-time crisis intervention. The cameras kept rolling, capturing a rescue happening in real time. "He'll kill me," Jennifer said, loud enough for the microphones to catch clearly. "If I don't go home with him, he'll find me, and he'll kill me. He's told me 1,000 times." The matter-of-fact way she said it was more chilling than if she'd screamed. Mark was now being physically restrained by security, shouting threats that were being broadcast live to millions of viewers. "Jennifer, get down here right now. You know what happens when you embarrass me." His words were a public confirmation of everything Jennifer had just revealed. Steve Harvey made a decision that would change Jennifer's life forever. He walked directly to the edge of the stage and spoke to the security team. "I want this man removed from the building now, and I want the police called." Turning back to Jennifer, Steve's voice was gentle but firm. "You're not going anywhere with him. Not today, not tonight, not ever again, unless you choose to." The power of choice, something Mark had stolen from her years ago, was being offered back. "But I don't have anywhere to go," Jennifer said, the practical reality of escape hitting her. "He controls all the money, all the accounts. I don't even have my own credit card. I have nothing." "You have your life," Steve replied, "and that's everything. Money can be figured out, but we can't figure out anything if you're dead." His words cut through years of Mark's manipulation about how Jennifer couldn't survive without him. What happened next would become one of the most powerful moments in television history. Steve turned to address the cameras directly, speaking to America about a crisis hiding in plain sight. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you're witnessing is why domestic violence is called a silent epidemic. This woman has been suffering in silence for 10 years, and today she found the courage to speak up." His words validated Jennifer's experience and gave context to millions of viewers who might be in similar situations. Behind the scenes, a domestic violence counselor had arrived at the studio. The production team had called the National Domestic Violence Hotline, and trained professionals were now standing by to help Jennifer navigate her next steps. Television was becoming a launching pad for a new life. "Jennifer," Steve said, "there are people here who specialize in helping women in your exact situation. They know how to keep you safe, how to help you start over, how to make sure Mark can never hurt you again." The promise of safety, something Jennifer hadn't felt in a decade, seemed impossible but desperately wanted. The cameras captured the moment when Jennifer's face began to change. The fear didn't disappear entirely, but it was joined by something else: hope. For the first time in years, she could imagine a future that didn't include violence. "What about my things?" Jennifer asked, the practical concerns of escape flooding her mind. "My clothes, my pictures, my grandmother's jewelry?" These were the details that often trapped women in abusive relationships. The seemingly impossible logistics of leaving. "Material things can be replaced," Steve said gently. "You cannot be, and there are legal ways to get your personal belongings back safely." He was helping Jennifer understand that she didn't have to choose between her life and her possessions. As Mark was escorted from the building, still shouting threats and accusations, Jennifer felt something she hadn't experienced in years: relief. The immediate danger was gone, and for the first time she could think clearly about her situation, without fear clouding her judgment. The domestic violence counselor approached the stage and introduced herself to Jennifer. Her name was Sarah, and she'd been helping abused women for 15 years. "We're going to make sure you're safe tonight and every night after that," she promised. "You're not alone anymore." Steve watched this exchange with tears in his eyes. In 40 years of television, he had never felt more proud of using his platform for something truly important. Entertainment had taken a back seat to salvation, and it felt like the most meaningful work he'd ever done. The episode would be edited carefully, with experts consulted on how to present Jennifer's story in a way that would help other victims without endangering them. The focus would be on resources, safety planning, and the message that help was available. 6 months after the taping, Jennifer was living in a new city under legal protection. The restraining order against Mark was comprehensive, and he was facing criminal charges for the threats he'd made on television. Jennifer had started therapy and was slowly rebuilding her sense of self. The apartment Jennifer now called home was small but safe. For the first time in a decade, she could sleep without fear, speak without calculating consequences, and make decisions based on what she wanted rather than what would minimize violence. Freedom felt strange, but wonderful. Jennifer began volunteering at a local domestic violence shelter, sharing her story with other women who were still trapped in abusive relationships. Her experience of escaping in such a public way gave her a unique perspective on how to find help and safety. The Family Feud episode became a training tool for law enforcement and domestic violence organizations. It showed how abusers operate in public, how victims behave under threat, and how bystanders can intervene effectively when they recognize the signs. Steve Harvey established a fund to help domestic violence survivors with the practical costs of leaving: security deposits, legal fees, temporary housing, and other expenses that often keep women trapped. Jennifer became a spokesperson for the fund, sharing her story to help others. Today, Jennifer works as a victim advocate, helping other women navigate the legal and emotional challenges of escaping abuse. The bruises have faded, but the strength she discovered that day on stage continues to grow. She carries business cards with the domestic violence hotline number, distributing them wherever she goes. The long-sleeved blouse she wore that day hangs in Jennifer's closet as a reminder of how far she's come. Next to it hangs a sleeveless dress, something she never could have worn when Mark controlled her wardrobe. The contrast represents death and rebirth, captivity and freedom. Mark violated his restraining order twice, and is now serving a prison sentence for stalking and making terroristic threats. Jennifer testified at his sentencing, no longer the terrified woman who had whispered her fears on stage. She was strong, clear, and unafraid. Because some questions reveal more than they ask, and some answers change everything. Jennifer Walsh thought she was trapped forever, but she learned that courage can bloom even in the darkest places. Her whispered confession became a shout for freedom that inspired thousands of other women to find their own voices. The miracle that happened on that Thursday afternoon in Atlanta proves that sometimes salvation comes disguised as entertainment. And sometimes the most important thing a person can do is simply ask, "Are you safe?" Jennifer's answer changed her life and reminded the world that behind closed doors, millions of people are waiting for someone to notice their pain and offer them a way out. The weeks following Jennifer's escape were the most challenging and liberating of her life. The safe house where she initially stayed was a revelation: women who understood her story, counselors who believed her without question, and resources she never knew existed. For the first time in years, Jennifer could speak freely about her experiences without fear of retribution. The legal process of obtaining a permanent restraining order was complex, but empowering. Jennifer had to recount years of abuse in sworn statements, but each testimony felt like reclaiming her voice. The judge who granted the order looked directly at her and said, "You are incredibly brave." Those 5 words began to reshape how Jennifer saw herself. Steve Harvey personally called Jennifer during her second week in the safe house. His voice was warm and reassuring as he checked on her progress and reminded her that his support was ongoing. "You saved your own life that day," he told her. "I just happened to be standing nearby when you decided to be brave." The media attention from the episode was overwhelming but ultimately positive. Dozens of journalists wanted to interview Jennifer, but she was selective, choosing only those who understood the importance of protecting survivors' privacy while sharing their stories. Each interview became an opportunity to educate the public about domestic violence. Jennifer's family relationships were complicated by her escape. Her parents, who had suspected but never confronted the truth about Mark, were riddled with guilt for not intervening sooner. Her sister, who had always disliked Mark but remained silent, became Jennifer's strongest supporter and advocate during the healing process. The transition to independence was frightening after 10 years of having every decision controlled. Choosing what to eat for breakfast, which clothes to wear, or which TV show to watch required rebuilding decision-making muscles that had atrophied under Mark's domination. Simple choices felt overwhelming but gradually became empowering. Financial independence proved to be one of the biggest challenges. Mark had controlled all their finances, and Jennifer had to start from zero with building credit, opening bank accounts, and learning to manage money. The family feud prize money helped, but more importantly, Steve's foundation provided practical support for these transition costs. Therapy revealed the depth of psychological manipulation Jennifer had endured. She learned terms like gaslighting and trauma bonding that explained experiences she thought were unique to her relationship. Understanding that Mark's behavior followed predictable patterns helped Jennifer realize that nothing about the abuse had been her fault. The nightmares took months to subside. Jennifer would wake up convinced that Mark had found her, that the safety was just a dream. The safe house counselors explained that hypervigilance was a normal trauma response, and that healing would be a gradual process, requiring patience with herself. Steve Harvey arranged for Jennifer to speak at a domestic violence conference 6 months after her escape. Standing on stage, voluntarily, sharing her story with advocates and survivors, felt like the ultimate victory over Mark's attempts to silence her. The standing ovation lasted 5 minutes, and many audience members approached her afterward to share their own stories. The apartment Jennifer eventually rented was small but perfect. A 1-bedroom space with multiple locks on the door and windows that let in abundant natural light. She decorated it slowly, choosing every item herself, creating a space that reflected her personality rather than someone else's control. The freedom to hang pictures where she wanted felt revolutionary. Jennifer's relationship with her extended family improved as they learned about the reality of domestic violence. Her uncle, who had once criticized her for not standing up for herself, became an advocate and volunteer at the local shelter. Education replaced judgment, and Jennifer found herself surrounded by support she never expected. The legal proceedings against Mark extended for over a year. His lawyers tried various defense strategies, including claiming that Jennifer had fabricated everything for attention and money. But the evidence was overwhelming. The televised threats, the documented history of police calls, and the testimony of multiple witnesses who had seen signs of abuse. Dating seemed impossible and undesirable for years after Jennifer's escape. The idea of trusting another man with her heart and safety felt like an insurmountable challenge. Her therapist assured her that healing would happen at her own pace, and that there was no timeline for when or if she chose to pursue romantic relationships again. The domestic violence shelter where Jennifer volunteered became her second home. Working with newly escaped women reminded her daily of how far she'd come while keeping her connected to the ongoing need for advocacy and support. Many women arrived in situations eerily similar to her own story. Jennifer's public speaking became more sophisticated and impactful over time. She learned to tailor her message for different audiences: law enforcement officers who needed to understand victim behavior, teenagers learning about healthy relationships, and corporate groups implementing workplace domestic violence policies. Each speech potentially saved lives. The anniversary of her Family Feud appearance became an annual celebration of freedom for Jennifer. She marked it by doing something Mark would never have allowed: traveling alone, speaking publicly, or simply enjoying a peaceful day without fear. These celebrations reinforced how dramatically her life had changed. Steve Harvey's continued involvement in domestic violence advocacy was partly inspired by Jennifer's story. He began including domestic violence resources in all his media projects and speaking engagements. The partnership between his foundation and national domestic violence organizations grew into a significant funding and awareness campaign. The Family Feud production team implemented new protocols for identifying and responding to domestic violence situations. After Jennifer's episode, they trained staff to recognize warning signs and developed partnerships with local advocacy organizations to ensure appropriate resources were always available during tapings. Jennifer's story inspired policy changes at the state level regarding domestic violence prosecutions. Lawmakers cited her case when passing legislation that strengthened protections for victims and increased penalties for abusers who made public threats. Her courage had legal ramifications far beyond her individual situation. The writing Jennifer began as therapy evolved into a book project documenting her journey from victim to survivor to advocate. The memoir would later become a bestseller, with proceeds supporting domestic violence shelters and legal aid organizations. Her story reached hundreds of thousands of readers worldwide. Educational institutions began using Jennifer's Family Feud episode in criminology and social work curricula. Students analyzed the dynamics of abuse, the barriers to leaving, and the importance of community intervention. Jennifer occasionally guest lectured at universities, bringing real-world experience to academic theory. The international response to Jennifer's story was unexpected but profound. Women from countries with limited domestic violence resources reached out through social media, sharing their own stories and seeking advice. Jennifer realized that abuse transcended cultural and geographic boundaries, and her message of hope was universally relevant. Jennifer's physical health improved dramatically. After escaping abuse, chronic headaches, digestive issues, and sleep problems that she'd attributed to stress gradually disappeared. Her doctor explained that these had likely been manifestations of long-term trauma, and their resolution was another indicator of her healing progress. The friendship networks Jennifer built in her new life were based on mutual respect and genuine care relationships. Unlike anything she'd experienced during her marriage, learning to trust friends, set boundaries, and communicate her needs was part of rebuilding social skills that abuse had damaged. These friendships became crucial to her continued healing. Jennifer's professional life flourished as she gained confidence and skills through her advocacy work. What had started as volunteer testimony grew into a full-time career as a victim services coordinator. She earned certifications in crisis counseling and legal advocacy, becoming an expert in the field that had once been her personal nightmare. The ripple effects of Jennifer's courage continued, expanding years after her initial escape. Women who had seen her story found their own strength to leave abusive relationships. Law enforcement officers changed their approach to domestic violence calls after understanding victim psychology better. Society's conversation about abuse shifted toward support and understanding rather than judgment. Today, Jennifer leads a team of advocates at a multi-state domestic violence organization. Her office walls are covered with thank you letters from survivors and photos from speaking engagements across the country. The scared woman who whispered her fears on national television had become a powerful voice for change and healing. The long-sleeved blouse from that fateful day is now part of a museum exhibit about domestic violence awareness. It stands as a symbol of how abuse hides in plain sight and how one moment of courage can change everything. Jennifer donated it knowing that her story could continue helping people even when she wasn't there to tell it personally. Mark's imprisonment became an opportunity for Jennifer to work with the criminal justice system on reforming how domestic violence cases are handled. She served on advisory committees developing better protocols for victim safety and offender rehabilitation. Even her abuser's punishment became a tool for preventing future violence. The confidence Jennifer gained through her advocacy work extended to every area of her life. She learned to drive. Mark had never allowed her to have a license, traveled internationally for speaking engagements, and even tried activities like rock climbing that would have been unthinkable during her marriage. Each new experience reinforced her freedom. Jennifer's story became a case study in successful domestic violence intervention and survivor empowerment. Social workers, law enforcement officers, and advocates studied her journey to understand how individual courage, community support, and systemic resources could combine to save lives and create positive change. The annual scholarship fund Jennifer established in partnership with Steve Harvey's foundation sends dozens of domestic violence survivors to college each year. Education, she learned, was one of the most powerful tools for preventing future victimization and building independent, fulfilling lives after abuse. Because some whispers become roars, and some moments of terror transform into lifetimes of purpose. Jennifer Walsh thought she was confessing her deepest shame on national television, but she was actually declaring her independence and lighting a path for countless others to follow. Her story proves that courage is contagious, and that sometimes the most important thing we can do is simply tell the truth about our pain.